Hey everybody, welcome back to the Luke Deckard Show. I'm your host, Luke Deckard. I can see people are already starting to filter in and comment in the chat. So hello, thanks for tuning in to tonight's special event, writing historical crime fiction with Anna Mazzola and DV Bishop. Just so you know, you can put your questions in the chat, and throughout the night we will respond to them. We won't be able to respond to them all, but we will do our best. But yeah, this is sort of a part of National Crime Reading Month. I thought it would be fun to do some crime fiction related stuff. A lot of times I bring crime writers on my show to talk about other things like pop culture stuff. But tonight it's a full-on crime fiction night. So without further ado, I will bring in the guests, the people you want to see. We have Anna Mazzola. Welcome, Anna. And DV Bishop. Welcome. Do you want DV or David? How would you like to be known by?
David's fine.
Okay.
For purposes of.
And the first question in the chat is, how many Smallville figures do you have? Which is a joke to me because he can see my Smallville figure. It's my friend Frank. He's being facetious. So let's learn a little bit about both of you before we go into stuff. It's more interesting, I think, if people hear from you than rather hear from me talk about you. So, Anna, we'll hear from you first. Give the audience a little bit about yourself as a who you are as a writer, kind of stuff you're into writing wise, and maybe tell us something you're currently reading.
Sure. Hi everyone. So I'm Anna Mazzola. I write what's generally called historical crime or historical gothic. But I'm also now writing legal thrillers as well. And I've had 4 books published, the latest of which is called The House of Whispers, which is a rather spooky story set in fascist Italy. Oh, there you go. Look at that. On cue. Thank you. Amazing. So yeah, I mean, I read quite a broad range of stuff, lots of crime, lots of historical, but also other things as well. And in terms of what I'm reading at the moment, I'm actually doing a lot of reading about poison. So that's been good fun and also, practical. So if you need any poisoning tips, do hit me up. But yeah, my next book, the book that I'm writing at the moment, is set in 17th century Italy and is based on a real case about a ring of poisoners. So I've been doing a lot of reading about botanical remedies, but also, things that kill people. So that's been good fun. But that's me.
Wonderful. Love it. David, same questions. And so, what are you reading?
What am I writing? What am I reading? So I write the Cesare Aldo historical thrillers set in Renaissance Florence, the latest of which is Ritual of Fire.
Yes, but I don't have that. I have the second one at the moment. I haven't got the third one yet.
Handily enough, I have the Shrine of Me just nicely lined up here, 3 in a row there. So yes, the first one was The Vengeance, which came out 2 years ago in the depths of lockdown. The Darkest Sun, which came out last year. And then the new one, Ritual of Fire, which came out, I think, 2 weeks ago, 1st of June. It came out in hardback and audiobook and ebook. So yes, and before that, I wrote a lot of other things.
Yes.
Science fiction, fantasy, horror, World War II, you name it, I probably wrote it at some point.
Yes.
But now I'm writing historical crime fiction. And what am I reading? I have, to my shame, only just started reading the M.W. Craven Tilly and Poe novels. Because everybody kept telling me how good they were, and I was like, "Oh, they can't all be right." And the answer is, of course, yes. There's a reason why everybody keeps telling me how good they are. It's because they're that good. So stupidly, I started with number 4 in the series, and now I'm having to go back and start at the beginning and work my way forwards again. But no, they're very good. Contemporary thriller, police procedural type novels. Nice. Excellent.
So here's a question that's just spawned from what you've just said there. Do you think it would be wise for publishers to put the number on the book as to what order it is meant to be in?
Oh, well, for series, of course, we're talking about here. For series fiction, it feels a bit sort of, I don't know, Famous 5, number 17 is the problem. No knocking the Famous 5, honestly. I mean, George is my role model.
Yes.
But yeah,
what about on the
you can just open the book and look inside, and there's a list in order of what they are. So I'm against.
All of yours can be read as standalones as well, really, can't they?
Increasingly so. The second one has a lot of sequel elements built into it, but I do try and write in a way that anybody can pick them up and read them and enjoy them. Buy them all, of course, would be my motto, but subtle.
No,
But
you need to read them all. That's what you need to say. You need to read them
yeah,
all.
yes, no, please read them all, absolutely. Or better still, just buy them. Read them is up to you, but buy them. But no, I'm going to say I'm against. Actually, I'm against putting numbers on the side.
Well, what on the inside page then? Because sometimes you'll open a book and they'll have a list, but they won't all be in order. And even if at least if that list was definitely in order, I would be like, great.
Yeah, no, that drives me crazy actually. When they have a list, but the list of the books in the series are not in the correct publication order. I'm like, what is that about? That's no. Then you're just sitting there in the bookshop with your phone going, Tilly and Poe books in order, which is literally what I had to do to try and figure it out. So.
And you can't look at your phone in a bookshop because they think you're looking it up on Amazon, which is what
and ordering it while you're standing in the bookshop. Yeah. But I'm like, I'm not buying. Look, no buying.
So anyway, people, historical crime fiction. Okay, let's chat a bit about your methods first, because I think that's something that people in general seem to find interesting. They like to know what the writer's method is. How do you approach your stories? How do you go about researching them? What's your routine? So that's the first question is what is your daily writing routine? How do you gear up to you've got your target of what you want to write? How do you get yourself in that space? And generally, what do you try to target yourself with word count wise?
On you go, Anna.
I'll go first so I can be the unimpressive one, and then we hear about your word count and realise that I'm a failure. But no, I always enjoy talking about sort of routine and form with other writers, because it is really interesting how differently writers approach it. Now that I'm, for the first time in my life, I am now writing full time, at least for a few weeks, until the children are on school holidays. My routine is that I have to be, so I drop the kids off at school and then I have to be writing by 9 a.m. I can't let any of the other nonsense of life take over. I have to write 9 till 12. Those of you who follow me on social media will know that actually I am occasionally online at that time, but I'm not supposed to be. So if you see me on there, tell me to go away. So yes, I have to write 9 till 12, certainly if I'm working on a first draft. And then later in the afternoon, obviously if I still feel like writing, then I'll carry on, but often I'll be doing other stuff during that time, like admin, publicity, and the various other things that you need to be doing. But I need to be writing for at least 2 hours a day to feel like I'm properly writing, and in order to get into the book. And in terms of word target, this is where I sound seriously unimpressive. I'm not a fast writer at all. And if I'm writing a first draft, I'm trying to write about 1,500 words a day. It will sometimes be 2,000. Sometimes it'll be a struggle even to make 1,000. But I try and do that every day, even if I think it's nonsense. And I do think it is kind of important to just make yourself write sometimes. It's that Toni Morrison quote about you can't wait for the inspiration to come. You've just got to sit down at your desk and write, because if you waited for the inspiration to come, you might be waiting an awful long time. And so I just make myself write, and I make myself hit the word count so that I can't focus too much on how bad it is, because first drafts are always bad. So that's how I do the first draft. And now we're going to hear about how David writes 5 million words a day.
Used to. Sadly, not anymore. I used to work in the salt mines of licensed tie-in fiction. So I used to write Doctor Who and Judge Dredd novels and all sorts of A Nightmare on Elm Street novel for my sins. Although I did quite enjoy doing that, it has to be said. And for those, I used to have to write a very detailed synopsis in order to get the contract to write the book. So my synopsis would often be 7, 8, 10,000 words long. And it really was every beat of the story was laid out. So when the time came to draft, it was like add dialogue and description and on you go. So I'd done most of the heavy lifting, had been done 6 months in advance when I had to do the synopsis. And then I would spend 6 months deliberately not writing the book. And then because I knew I could write at that stage 4,000 words a day comfortably, 5 days a week, it meant I could write an 80,000 word first draft in a month. So I would wait until a month before my deadline, and then I would start writing the book, because that level of brinksmanship brings a certain, frisson of excitement / terror to the feeling of, oh God, I need to deliver that in a month. So yes, I used to do that. I used to write unfeasible amounts. I once calculated in the year 2004, I had 600,000 words published in one form or another in books and comics and audio dramas and all sorts of stupid things that I was writing then. So I don't do that anymore. I now teach 4 days a week, running the creative writing programs at Edinburgh Napier University in Scotland. As a consequence of which, on my teaching days, my goal is about 500 new words per day. And that's Tuesday through Friday. It's 500 words a day. Then that's 2,000 words in those days. So that leaves me Saturday, Sunday, Monday. I need to get a minimum currently to hit my deadline of I need to get the other 4,000 words spread out over those Saturday, Sunday, Monday in whatever order or shape they turn up in. So it's 6,000 words a week is my budget I'm working to, because I've got to get to 100 to 110,000 words by the end of July, basically.
That makes me feel better. Okay, so that's about the same as me, really.
Yeah,
now.
so it is, yeah. So it averages out about the same.
Yeah. But I would say, I mean, I assume we're going to have people listening who are maybe, you know, starting writing or have started relatively recently. And I would say that when I started writing, it was more like 500 words a day. And I remember when I first met the wonderful Mick Heron, who's just the most lovely man as well as a genius, he told me that when he started writing, and he was working this time, he was writing 350 words a day, which sounds like a small amount, but see, he seems to have done all right from that beginning. Yes. So
and it all piles up as well, of course. You know, if you can, even if you're only doing 250 words a day, 4 days a week, it's 1,000 words. You know, it means you'll have, if not a first draft by the end of the year, you'll have a good chunk of it. So it can, you can do it in small. But the challenge I find, particularly having to write 500 words a day, 4 days a week, is that it means I don't even get to finish a scene, and then I have to come back and then finish the scene and then go, oh, what's next? And I will get to a point where 3 weeks will have elapsed and I'll be going, I can't honestly remember what the characters know anymore. So I have to keep going back. I've got the death of hope is the spreadsheet as far as I'm concerned, but I do keep a spreadsheet, which I just add, okay, in this chapter, this happened and this happened. Then I know what people know and how they feel about things. So therefore I can write the next scene knowing they have what knowledge and what their motivation is or who they're angry with at this point in the story. So
interesting. So you do it as a spreadsheet?
Well, just my plot beats. I just keep a log of those every about halfway through each, because I write it in sort of days. So the story's written in a day, and it's about the story, the events of a day, and then I will stop and review that day's events, and then replot for the next day to see what's going to happen. So I'm like Wallace and Gromit. I'm just laying the track down in front of myself. Enough plot to write for the next week or two, and then I don't have to think. I can just write.
So what is your Gromit of historical fiction? I love it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
that's good. So let's move on to research, because research is tricky enough. I think writing a contemporary novel, there's enough stuff in contemporary fiction that is you have to do a lot of detailed research depending on the topic. But sometimes I do feel that writing historical fiction can be I don't want to say harder or more tricky, but there is an added layer of difficulty with historical fiction, I think, because not only do you have to investigate even if you're talking about a 1930s on a bus in London is very different to 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. So there's all these different layers you have to kind of peel and pull together. So how do you go about researching your historical novels? How do you lay that foundation with your research?
Yeah, sure. I mean oh, sorry, you carry on.
Oh, so I was just going to say I'm lucky because I'm writing a series. My research is cumulative, whereas poor Anna every book's in a different time period and often a different country. So making much more of a rug for their back there. I'm lucky in because it's a series and it's building chronologically through time. So for the first book, I spent 20 years not writing it because I was so terrified that I didn't know everything totally about the period. And eventually I just had to say, you're never going to know everything about the period. You're just going to have to bite down and get on with it, and then accept that you will get some things wrong, but do your best to try and make as few mistakes as possible. And if it gets published, there'll be copy editors who are our saviors and our saints. and our nightmares. At the same time, who will go, really? It's Lent. The butcher shop is shut. Think of another place for this to happen. I mean, they didn't phrase it quite like that, but that was the subtext. So it's the first book took a ton of research, vast amounts of research. I'm lucky now. I will before I start writing a book, I will go, right, it's going to happen on these dates in this month, this year, and then I've got all my research books, and I go, okay, what's happening? What's going on? Who's done what to whom? Who's recovering from smallpox? Who's pregnant? Who's done whatever? And then move on from there. So I'm fortunate mine's cumulative. Anna, however, likes a challenge.
Yes, or is a complete idiot. I remember doing an interview with Ben Kane where he basically said, Anna, why don't you just write a series? Why do you change era and country every single book? Yes, I agree with you, Luke. I wouldn't say it's necessarily an extra layer of difficulty, but it's certainly an extra layer of time. It takes longer to write a historical novel because, I mean, obviously you do have to do research for a contemporary novel, but you do, I think, have to do more for a historical novel if you want to really get the era, get a proper flavour for the era. I love the research. I find the research much more rewarding and interesting than the writing bit. So I tend to spend too long on the research. And again, it helps to have deadlines. And obviously, kindly, my publisher has given me unfeasible deadlines. But previously, I used to give myself deadlines to make myself get out of the rabbit hole of research and actually start writing them. Because as David says, you cannot know everything about that era. You know, we're not historians. We don't have PhDs in the area we're writing about. But again, with my first novel, I probably researched that novel for 2 years before I started writing. I was convinced I needed to know absolutely everything about 19th century London and 19th century justice and the state, you know, and it was all very interesting, but actually only a tiny fraction of that went into the ultimate book because what really the book is about telling the story, and the history is not the story. And it took me a very long time, and my agent beating me with a stick to work that out. It has got easier in the sense that I now feel like I can sort of give myself license to write in the knowledge that I'm never going to know everything about this era, and that yes, I will have someone writing to me in a few years' time to complain about an era, but I'm, you know, what I feel is that, so I tend to do a lot of broad research at the outset to kind of ground myself in the era and feel I can start writing, feel that I have the confidence to write the story. And then I'll plot it out, and then I'll start writing my terrible first draft. And as I'm writing the draft, I'm working out what other things I need to know in order to write the second draft. And I try not to do a lot of research while I'm doing the draft because I'll just go off researching for months. And again, if you follow me on social media, you'll know that I break my own rules because I'm always tweeting about bits of research that I find when I should be doing my first draft. But yeah, so that's supposed to be my rule because I think otherwise you could stay with the research forever. But I would say now that I'm writing modern thrillers as well, I'm surprised at how much I'm having to research. And even things like, because my novel is actually set in 2015, so I'm having to work out various things about 2015 because my memory just isn't good enough to remember. And obviously you have to, whereas with historical crime, there was certainly at the time we're writing, there's no DNA, there's not really much in the way of policing. So you can sort of do your own thing. And that is actually quite useful in order to be able to tell a story. So the investigator in my book I'm writing at the moment is a prosecuting lawyer. And you know, he was essentially an investigator, but I don't really know anything about him. I don't know what he would have done. There's no record. So I'm making it up. Whereas for my modern novel, I do need to know what the police are doing. And, you know, I, you know, had the joy of speaking to a pathologist a few times to make sure I've got that right. Because, you know, people will definitely call you out if you get stuff wrong in modern novels.
Yeah. It's true. So when you're writing the you know about the past, I'm also curious, how do you place yourself in the past when you're writing them, or do you at all? Like
we have a machine, David and I. We can press any number and go back to whatever era. No, if only. Sorry, carry on with your question.
Yeah, well, no, the question is when you're sitting there writing it, how do you kind of go about envisioning the past? How do you, when you sit down to write, how do you think, okay, I need to get myself in the mindset, because this is why, you know, you've done your research and stuff, but you're not really looking, you're writing your stuff. How do you put yourself in that frame of mind of, I'm in, you know, 40s Florence, you know, how do you do that?
David, you want to go first? No?
He might be. He might be
Yeah,
behind.
I mean, where possible. Yes, sorry, I'm catching you up.
You're back. You're back. I think.
Have you got me? Am I back?
Yes.
He went into the
Okay,
past.
yes.
It's now returned.
Well, into the past. Yeah, yeah. Well, that was. I was just pop back for a bit just to look at what the weather was like. I will, where possible. Obviously, lockdown made it very difficult for the last few years. You couldn't go to Florence and wander around and see what things look like. So I was having to rely a lot on the last trip I made, which was September 2019. And I'm going back in December, which alas is too late for the book I'm writing at the moment, annoyingly. But I'm sure it will help if I get to write beyond that. But yeah, so I think if you can go to the actual physical place and wander about and get a sense of the place,
Yeah.
I think that's hugely helpful. I mean, Google Street View will get you so far, but only so far.
Yeah.
And then it's just, and then if you can't go to the place, then if you can find any sort of diaries or letters or journals written by people of the period, or particularly personal diaries or letters, because they will have those sort of weird personal details that won't be in the history books. Sorry, I'm going to talk about nuns. This was inevitable. But when I was researching for The Darkest Sin, which is a locked room mystery set in a nunnery, I read these wonderful letters from one of the illegitimate daughters of Galileo writing to her father, which is why the letters survived. And she was like a nun, and she was 28. And by the time she was 28, she'd lost nearly all her teeth because A, oral hygiene, and B, the diet was so bad they had nearly no teeth left in their mouth by the time they were in their late 20s. And you're like, okie doke. I don't think I put that in the book, actually. But they just she spent all the time writing to her father and saying, could you send, cash or, more candied almonds, please, or maybe some marzipan. And then
That's why I had teeth wet.
I know. It's just lots of soft fruit, please. And they spent all their time making wine. So it's the small, tiny details that are really helped bring a setting or a period alive. Or the fact that servants lived on the top floor in Palazzo because, of course, all the heat rose and it was the hottest place in the house. So you would just melt.
Do you know where Luke is sitting right now? He's at the top of the house in the servant quarters.
That's exactly where I am.
Slowly melting.
Yes.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I do exactly the same. I mean, the first thing I tend to do is get a map. I love a map. I'll try and find a map of the era, and I've found you can just find amazing stuff online. I finally found this interactive map of Rome in the 17th century, which I'm using because I need to feel that I can move my characters around the board, if you like. I need to be able to envisage what the streets look like. And I'll often use art from the time because obviously there's no photography in the 17th century. So I found lots of amazing paintings of Rome in that era. And with my last book that was published, there were photographs. It was 1930. So I found some incredible photographs of the era. In fact, I tend to find, maybe this is again too much procrastination, but I tend to find a particular photographer's work and maybe buy the book and then have that on my desk so that I can sort of feel that I'm in that era. And yes, letters are a fantastic resource and memoirs, but letters are particularly good. And so are legal proceedings. I mean, I would say this as a lawyer, but in legal proceedings, you'll get the witnesses' own voices, which is incredible. So this book I'm writing at the moment, I've actually managed to get hold of the 17th century notary's account of the whole thing. And obviously it's been written by him. So it's not the women's own voices directly, but he is recording what they're saying. So I've got these, and then you can get little phrases that they use and use that within your work. So things like they say his breath smelled like a sepulchre. And when I was writing my second novel, which was set on the Isle of Skye in the 19th century, an archivist on Skye found me some letters that had been written by people who'd been evicted during the clearances and transported to Australia, Canada, America, and they'd written letters back. And so there you heard, the people's voices, how they actually spoke to one another. So, and I try and take things from that so that I can feel like I'm in the era. I mean, some people use music. Some people will play, harpsichord music or whatever. I don't. I have to have relative silence in order to work. But I remember Beth Underdown saying that before she goes to bed, she'll read like a memoir or a letter or something from the era in which she's writing so that she can kind of imbibe it while she sleeps and write about it the next day. I thought
Wow,
Mazzola.
that's a level of professionalism I haven't got to.
Exactly.
Got to work my way.
Nope.
Under my cushion, my pillow.
We have an interesting question in the chat from Rose Evans. She says, "Hi, Anna. Anna just wanted to say hi. We've been chatting on Facebook about the novelry, and I'm loving it. Question for you both: what do you think about appropriation? It actually terrifies me."
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think you mean the cultural appropriation. Yeah, I mean, it is quite a concerning thing for writers, and we do need to make sure. And it was a thing because I used to be until very recently a tutor at the Novelry. Sadly, I just don't have time to do it at the moment. But I got to speak to loads of amazing writers and people sort of starting off on their stories. And appropriation is a big concern for writers and new writers because you may well be wanting to tell the story of someone who is not like you, but you need to feel that you're sort of entitled to do so and that you can do it. And and we've all seen the sort of furore on social media when anyone gets it wrong. Yes. So I can't, certainly the advice they gave at the Novelry was just, think about the reasons you want to write this story. Yeah. And have good reasons for writing of it. And then, approach it sensitively, which I'm sure, you are doing. Approach it sensitively and do your research. Make sure you understand what you're writing about and that it's not... And also get a sensitivity read, or ideally get a friend from that culture to read it through and discuss it with you. But I had in the Clockwork Girl, I had a black character who had been a slave. He wasn't a major character, but it did make me nervous. Have I got this right? And I did talk to friends about it, and I did a huge amount of research, and then I did get a sensitivity read. And so far, no one has shouted at me. But I think it is a concerning thing for writers, and I don't know if you saw. And it's absolutely right that it's being challenged now that white people should be writing stories that don't belong to them. That's absolutely right that it should be challenged, but I think it's a difficult one to navigate. And I saw that Elizabeth Gilbert has pulled. Did you see this? Elizabeth Gilbert has pulled a book that was set in historical Russia because she got a huge amount of criticism for writing a book set in Russia at this time, even though, as I understand it, it was quite critical of Russia. And that's slightly frightening because you kind of think, what are we allowed to write? Yeah. So I absolutely, have those discussions. And I'm sure, Rose, that your tutor at the Novelry will help you with that. And I know they were thinking about getting someone in to talk about it because it is something that concerns so many of us, and getting it right is so important. And I don't know, what do you think, David?
Yeah, I'm just going to nod along and agree with pretty much everything you said. I mean, do your research. And I think somebody was suggesting, rather than, I think one of the things that some people gets their back up is the idea of a sensitivity reader, because then you get into a whole woke sensitivity snowflake, all that kind of rubbish.
I was just going to say that Ollie Munson was saying that he doesn't call them sensitivity readers, he calls them authenticity readers, which I think is
exactly. And I think that's a better name,
word.
Because that's actually what the job is really about, is to make sure that you're writing something that isn't wildly at odds with the reality of the situation, whether it's to do with sexuality or gender or race or religion or whatever the circumstance may be. I think authenticity readers are a much better way. I mean, it's like a copy editor does some, it's to me, it should be, if possible, a part of the process. If you feel that you're venturing into territory where it's not your lived experience, then you do your research. Of course you do. And I mean, I certainly did that with the City of Vengeance, because there's a lot of Jewish characters in the book, and I'm not of the Jewish faith, so I gave it to a friend of mine who is Jewish to really say, does this seem credible in the context of the time, the period, and the faith that people had then? And we're talking about essentially Orthodox, what we would now call Orthodox Jews. So you have to think, right, now I want to try and get this right, just like I want to try and get it right as to what they were eating, or whether or not they had tomatoes yet, or whether or not there were pews in churches. I mean, it's all part of the same thing, effectively. But the whole you can only write your own experience. Well, gosh, that's going to be terribly boring load of novels in the future. Just writers writing about novelists. I mean, that's the death of hope, surely, or imagination.
Yeah. I wholly agree with that. Everything you said, I agree. Do your research, but I don't think we should ever say that an individual can't write about a topic because they are not of that. But you do your research. It's simple. It's simple.
Well, it's not simple. I think it's really complicated, but
Well, it's simple. It's a simple bit of information, but it's complicated in practice.
yeah,
It's
Yes.
complicated getting someone to do that work, for with you. Read your book, give you the feedback. That is the complicated bit, but make the effort.
yeah.
Yeah.
But what's good, I think, is that we're now talking about it. That we are having these discussions. And thank you for asking the question, Rose, because I think it's important to talk about it. And
Yeah.
and the more we talk about it, the better. Hopefully, we will become as writers and better at dealing with it.
Yeah, and also it's this is where we are now. Come back in 5 or 10 years and ask us what the situation is then, and I think how this sort of thing is dealt with will have evolved, because it's certainly evolved in the last 5 to 10 years. So I don't see why it won't keep on evolving into whatever direction it goes.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're I'm also curious about what comes first for you guys when you're writing your novels. Is it the character has sprung to life in your mind, or is it the story that's sprung to life first? Which comes first?
Neither.
Neither. What's the wild card number 3?
Start with a very vague idea, basically.
Oh, no.
I start with hopefully it will become more coherent over the course of the novel, but I tend to start with a vague idea of what I want to write about. So with The Clockwork Girl, I knew I wanted to write about automata and automaton maker. And it was from that I kind of got the vague idea for the story. Then I figured out who the characters were going to be. And then with the book I'm writing at the moment, it kind of was the character first, but that's because it's based on a real character. It's based on a real poisonous. That was easier. But to be honest, I know some people kind of say that the character will just speak to them. And I wish a character would speak to me, but they're generally quite silent until I'm some way into the book. So I start with generally a vague idea of what I want to write, and then work out from that what the story is and who the characters need to be in order to tell the story.
Nice.
But what about you, David?
I mean, obviously, because it's a series, that means I've got a pre-existing cast. So, but then actually the challenge then becomes picking a story that's going to work with the characters that I had. So I'm writing book 4 at the moment, which is all about exorcisms and more exorcisms, effectively.
Ooh.
And there's a serial killer as well.
Sounds good.
You eventually have to just tick the box that says, yes, I have written my serial killer book. I don't need to bother again. Thank you very much. I can keep my crime writers card fully stocked. But before I started writing that, I pitched another book 4, to my editor, and I sent it off, and I went, yes, I could definitely write this. And then 24 hours later, I went, yeah, but this isn't an Aldo story. This doesn't suit my main character, because it was all about children and the exploitation of children. And Aldo's a gay man. He doesn't have any children. He's not going to have any children to the best of his knowledge. So it felt like it wasn't his story to investigate. It didn't feel like it went with him. So I thought, it's a perfectly good story. It could work for one of the other characters. It's just not an Aldo story. So I just had to go, you know what, that book idea I sent you, we'll just stick a pin in that, and I'll go away and have another thought. And then I had a thought for another story, and I went, yes, this is a more Aldo story, but there's another story I want to tell. And then finally I went, oh no, Exorcists, of course, that's the solution. And that came from going on a walking tour of Florence the last time I was there. And the guide was talking about, they were taking us around the city, and it was lovely, pointing out different things. And they said, oh, and down there is the Church of San Felice, and they do exorcisms there on a Tuesday if you need one. And I was like, oh, well, I'll bear that in mind, thanks. If I'm in town on a Tuesday and I need to be exorcised, then I know where to go. But they've been doing exorcisms there for more than 500 years. And I just went, oh, exorcisms, that's the way forward. So it's finding the story that goes with my character, even though my character's actually, I think it may be more important to make sure the story fits the character.
Yeah.
If I was to write a standalone, then the question then becomes, is it character, is it story? But I think setting plays a big part as well. I think that really is, that's key often.
Yeah.
My fourth one features an exorcism. So I think maybe everyone's fourth historical novel needs to feature an exorcism. Maybe that's the rule.
Oh, well, good. Okay, well, I'm glad I'm ticking that box as well then. Excellent. This
Okay, great.
News. Success. Done.
Oh, man. Okay, cool. So when you're with writing historical fiction, what are you trying to do with it? That's a kind of a big question, I think, is what's the purpose of historical fiction. So when you're sitting down to write, Florence in 1500s, and A House of the Whispers is 30s 1930s Rome. What are you trying to do with this period?
I think inevitably you're writing about the present. Your story just happens to be set in the past. So Ritual of Fire, there's a big subplot in it, which is to do with religious fundamentalism and people being manipulated and lied to and whipping up a mob culture and causing riots and threatening to overthrow the powers that be. And strangely enough, I may have been slightly inspired by the events of January 6th on Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
Because you sort of watch that and you go, wow, okay. And that's just, people just, too much Fox News for you people. And so you sort of go, right, well, what would the Renaissance Italian equivalent of that be? And so that's a big part of the book, is they're being told that the spirit of Savonarola, this mad monk who was responsible for the notorious bonfire of the Vanities. And they're told that 40 years after his execution, he's coming back, he's rising from the dead to save the city. And people believe it because there are people 40 years after his death, there were people who still prayed to Savonarola and wanted him to come back and save them all, even though he was hung and burnt and his ashes thrown in the river to make sure there was nothing left whatsoever. And yet the people still believe that he might still be alive. So, he was executed. Fake news. So it was, so I think you are writing about the past, but it's inevitably you are writing about the present. Certainly I am. That's how it feels.
Yeah, no, I think most historical fiction that tends to be successful is it has some echo of what is going on now, some relevance to what is going on now. And certainly that's why I ended up writing The House of Whispers. I mean, obviously it was mainly to get an exorcism into my book, but it was also when I started reading about, I basically started reading a lot about the 1930s during so it's interesting that, again, it was sort of partly Trump and sort of the rise of the far right. So I started reading a lot about the rise of fascism in Germany and Italy and across Europe. And that's and the thing that sparked the story idea was there was a comment piece that was actually, I think, about the Nazis, but it said that this is from the 1930s, it said that they were like poltergeists because they were harnessing or sucking upon the blood and energy of the young in order to cause destruction. And I thought that was really interesting parallel. So I decided I wanted to tell a story about the 1930s and the damage that was done by the fascist regimes and the way that the minds of young people were infiltrated and corrupted, and also about how lots of people just stood by and let it happen. People just didn't involve themselves. And that was something that I've read this fantastic memoir by a woman called Rosetta. I've forgotten her surname, but she was an activist in 1930s and 1940s Italy. And she referred to her family and a lot of the people around her as the grey people. They were the people who just sort of carried on with their lives and kept their heads down and didn't really pay attention to what was happening. And she says she was a grey girl. And then she realizes that she does have to take a stand about what's going on. So that's really what I wanted to write about. And I decided to set it in Italy rather than Germany, partly because we feel like we know quite a lot about Nazi Germany, whereas less tends to be known and discussed about Italy. And also because I'm half Italian, and so my Italian is better than my German. But yes, so I guess what I was trying to do was tell a story about the human impact of fascism and also of not paying attention to what's going on. And that obviously has resonance with what's going on now, and what the frightening things that we've seen happening over the past few years. But I don't know whether that's the point of historical fiction. It's kind of the point of it for me, because I want to be writing. I think I always want to be writing something that interests me, and generally things that make me angry. You have to be interested in or passionate about what you're writing. So if I'm writing about, and the case I'm writing about at the moment, again, 17th century Italy is obviously a very long time ago, but it is, spoiler, about a poisoning ring and the and the women are generally selling poison to women who are being abused by their partners, husbands, brothers, fathers. And again, violence against women and girls is something I'm pretty angry about, and something that I deal with in my day job when I have one. So again, it's sort of looking for historical cases that will bring out the modern day resonance. But as I say, I don't know if that's the point of what historical fiction is. I'm sure there's lots of different points to it. For me, I have to sort of care and be angry about that particular issue in order to write
it. Absolutely. It's what is the purpose of the thing that you're writing about? What's sort of the argument that you're presenting? It doesn't mean that everybody's going to get the argument, but you're layering it and then making it available to them, and they may disagree, they may agree. The one I'm writing at the moment, what really unlocked the next book for me was I was thinking exorcisms, and I just realized, it's a metaphor for conversion therapy. Basically, exorcism is a form of extreme religious conversion therapy. Pray away the gay, but with a load of extra crucifixes. So I went, that is the solution.
Nice.
Interesting.
We have another interesting question in the chat from Frank. He asks, is there any media or work that you go to for inspiration when in a tough spot while creating?
Good question. I mean, as I say, I use art a lot, and I tend to create Pinterest boards. Again, arguably that is procrastination, but I do find it useful to just look at portraits or photographs of the era and maybe look at and I'll often use I can't share my screen on this, but I'll often use portraits from the era and think, which of these are my characters? So with my current novel, I've actually found Renaissance portraits of each of my main characters in an attempt to try, because as I just mentioned earlier, my characters sadly don't just come and speak to me. I have to find them and work out who they are. So if I'm struggling with a character, I'll often find a portrait or a photograph of someone who I think is them. And that will help me sort of form them in my own mind. So when I was writing The House of Whispers, and I couldn't quite get a grip on my main character, Eva, I found her, and I've forgotten the name of the real Italian actress that she's based on now. It'll come to me in a moment, but I found this beautiful Italian actress from the 1930s. And as soon as I saw her, I was like, that's her, that's Eva. And she became then a lot clearer in my mind. And I still have her pinned to my desktop that I could look at her and think, what is Eva thinking? What's she doing? Yeah. How about you, David?
I don't have those go-tos. I wish I did, actually. Unlike you, I have music that I will choose. I have to find exactly the right music, and I will listen to it on repeat for the entire time that I'm writing a book, which could be 6 or 8 months of listening to the one piece of music. And it just plays on a loop. And it gets to the point where some days I forget to turn the music on because it's already playing in my head when I wake up. I've got, so for the book I'm writing at the moment, it's the soundtrack to Dangerous Liaisons from 1988, the film, which is quite harpsichordy, actually. But it's because I've got a character in the book, a new character in the book who's very much in the Matoy, the Glenn Close mode, very scheming and very delightful and delectable and deadly. And then it's the music from what looks like a terrible Spanish thriller, I have to say. But the film music is great, but I've watched the trailer and it looks bobbins. But it's completely doing the job. So I have those two back to back. That's an hour and 48 minutes. And then I will forget that the music has stopped because I'll still be writing because it's still playing in my head. So that I create the hypnotic trance. That's the theory. But yes, but when I get to the end of a book, I never want to listen to that music again. I have to say, I'm just like, oh God, I cannot listen to the music from The Piano by Michael Nyman ever again in my life.
I can play that. Shall we play a piece for you now?
No. I'm just like, oh.
That's interesting, actually. I don't, because as I said, I don't listen to music while I'm writing, but I will do, what I will do, and maybe this is weird, but Frank did ask, when I go running, I'll listen to music that kind of gets me into the mood. So I'll have certain, that certain atmosphere that I will want to create. So, unsurprisingly, it will generally be quite dark, moody music that will get me into the spirit of what I want to write. And even if I'm not actively thinking about my book while I'm running, I think something happens somewhere in my subconscious that means that when I then sit down to write, there's something else there. There's some other ideas there.
Yeah. And yes, when I was writing Ritual of Fire, I alternated between whatever the music was, and I bought a sound like one of those sound special effects, and I just bought the sound of a campfire burning because the book just features people being burned alive, and I just wanted the crackle of a campfire just going up while I was writing scenes of, and then he caught fire and he jumped out of the carriage and his hair was on fire. I can smell the pork roasting.
Lovely.
That's good. I like that. What's also interesting to me is identity. Identity is a big factor, I think, in both of your books, particularly the two that were David's and your most recent one, Anna. So I'm curious how does identity factor in when you're creating these characters and creating these books? And I guess, David, for you, that would be going back to, when you were creating City of Vengeance and you're, and Anna with House of the Whisper, House of Whispers. I don't know what I was gonna be like. I wanted to call it the House of the Dragon. That keeps going through my mind when
that's lovely. I love that title. It has no dragons in it.
I know. But yeah. So how does identity factor in when you were creating these books, and how did that link with the era that you were, that kind of complicated that identity, I think?
I mean, for mine, for Cesare Aldo, I mean, I'd already been researching and looking at it for 10 years and identifying when the book was going to start and what the key plot driver of it was. And I knew I needed a detective and he was going to do certain things. But what unlocked it was just simply, I was doing a screenwriting master's at the time, and we did this exercise called character hot seating, where you have to sit down and you have to be your character. And everybody in the class gets to ask questions about your character, like, what are they afraid of? Who do they love? Who do they hate? Questions that you wouldn't generally ask of yourself. And you're obliged in the character hot seat, you have to say the truth. You cannot lie. You could say, I don't know, if you haven't figured out the answer to a question, you haven't got that far into backstory yet. And they said, what's your character's biggest secret? And I just went, oh, well, he's gay. And I went, of course, that's it. And it unlocked everything about the character. Because once I had to go and do a lot of research about, well, okay, if you are gay at this point in time in history, what does that mean for you? What are the consequences of that? And then it was, the next step from that was going, being gay isn't his flaw. It's the fact that who can he trust is his biggest challenge, because potentially he could be executed for the performance of his sexuality. So that it meant I had somebody who was an outsider, who was always having to pretend to be something that they necessarily weren't. They had to be able to code switch. They had to be able to present themselves as a masculine male, Italian male the whole time, and yet, that was not with whom they wanted to be. So that unlocks so much about the character. And then once you have that in place, then other things had to be arranged around it to make sense of that. And then you have to be true to the honesty of the character. And so it's like, when somebody else finds out about Aldo's sexuality, what are the consequences of that for their relationship? And so that was something I was slightly in the darker sin. I was, in the first draft, I really bottled out of it. And my editor came back and I said, we both had our lists of things that need fixing in the book after the first draft. And the only thing he didn't have on his list was the thing that I bottled out of having this confrontation at the end of the book. So I went, and I've chickened out of doing that. So I really need to bite down and just, let's do this. This conversation has to be said for the characters and the future of the characters. We have to have this conversation, even if it has dreadful consequences. So finding the truth of the character, I think, was the key for me.
Yeah. Cool. Anna?
Luke, do you want me to answer that one? I can see we've got some questions, other questions.
We do. Sure, we can run through some questions real quick. Frank asks, basically wants to know what's the feeling like when you've kind of finished your books. Is it kind of melancholy, relief? How do you detach yourself from the world you've created?
I'm going to have to go and get my power cable because I'm down to 5%. So,
okay.
So you two can talk amongst yourselves, and I will just go off camera for 1 minute.
Go off for a second. Yeah, thanks, Frank. So, well, I mean, I never really feel that I finished it until it actually appears in a bookshop, and I'm not allowed to change it anymore. So I have sent off my latest one to my editor a few weeks ago.
Mm.
And my immediate feeling on sending it off was tiredness, because I've been working like most writers on a deadline. I've been working very late hours, and then I felt relief. And then a few days later, I felt, oh God, I shouldn't have sent that. It was a steaming pile of poo. And now I rather miss it. Now I've gone back to writing my legal thriller, and I actually miss working on the historical one. And I do often find that sometime after I've finished a book that I will actually miss working on that book, because to be honest, I much prefer the editing process to the drafting process. So so by the time I finish a book, although I'm tired, I will have enjoyed working on it, because I like that, the tweaking and polishing and making things better. And then of course you're into doing a first draft of another book, which for me is the toughest thing. So I will look back through rose-tinted spectacles at the former project. So that's generally how I feel, a mix of emotions.
Yeah.
Really.
I get that, definitely. Oh, and look, David is back. He's got power.
Hooray!
Phew.
Oh, I'm breathless. I'm running up and down the stairs now. Must get
Well,
bit.
you can catch your breath. I'll reiterate the question. It is, how do you feel when you finished your book, and how do you detach yourself from that world that you've created?
I mean, my first draft is, if not a final draft, it's pretty close to a final draft. I mean, I polish as I go. I'm that kind of person. So actually, it's usually in a pretty good state by the time I finish a first draft, and then I'll go away from it for a few days and sort of breathe a sigh of relief and try not to think about the characters, and then print it out and just go through it. And if I've got time, I will read the book out loud to myself, which is a laborious process that takes forever to do.
Yeah.
And mark it up as I'm going, and then put in the edits. And I do a cut and polish, which normally knocks about 10% out of it, out of the word count. And then if I'm happy, off it goes, and I'm like, yay, which lasts for about 30 seconds.
Yes, exactly. That's just what I was saying. The relief is followed by
You've pressed send, and you're like, yay. And then you wake up in the middle of the night with a cold sweat, go, oh God, no, I didn't. Oh, I forgot to. But this needs to. So then I will just start making a list I'll write my own edit letter to myself of all the things that I think my editor is going to tell me I need to fix in the next draft, which hopefully aren't too many. I did once manage to send a draft of one of the Aldo books to my editors, and on page 295 it says, oh yeah, write a scene here about this thing. And I had not noticed I completely forgot to write that scene in the book. It was just a note from Alex, my editor, seems to be a scene missing here.
At least you didn't do what I do, which I always used to send it on to my editor, but sometimes I do that with myself. And I came across one a while ago that said, set scene here, write while drunk. That was my note to myself. Unfortunately, that never went to an editor.
Amazing.
Yes. Or I'll write at the start of a scene, finesse start of this scene, and I'll have to remember to do it, because otherwise my eyes will just glaze over and not notice at all.
Yeah. Frank also asked, we have two questions left in the chat, and we'll wind down here shortly. He also asks, if you're out and about, you're not near your workspace, and an idea comes to you, how do you keep track of it, and write it down before you forget? What's your go-to with locking those ideas down?
I email myself generally, and so I get bizarre emails headed to myself, like, exorcism, sex scene, things like that. That's generally what I do. But I also do that thing that I think all writers do, which I'll wake up in the middle of the night and I'll think I've got an absolutely amazing idea, and I'm like, I must write this down because this is genius, and then I'll read it the following day and it's just crap. You guys do that?
Yes. Yep. Oh God, I once got up in the middle of the night. I didn't want to turn the light on because I don't think I was wearing enough at the time. And I wrote this idea down in the dark. And then when I got up the next morning, I'd written it in about a square centimeter. It was a whole page worth of notes. And it was just this block of ink. And I was going, that could have been genius.
It could have been.
It wasn't. Anything you write during the night, it's nonsense.
No. I will. My brain will wake me up at 4 a.m. and I'll be lying there and I go, oh, it's because they're Nazis or something. It's appropriate. And I go,
I
oh,
do,
of course.
yeah. I do think, though, that thinking about your book, this was told to me by a writing tutor years ago, and I agree with him. He says, think about your book before you go to sleep, rather than like, whoever it is you're having an argument with or something that's annoyed you that day, and let your brain think about it while you're sleeping. I do think there's something in that if you let your subconscious work on things.
Particularly if you haven't got it all plotted out in advance and you're stuck and you've got you're just like, what happens next? And then let your subconscious can do so much of the heavy lifting. Or when in doubt, have a bath, have a shower, go for a walk, just do some any activity where you're not near paper effectively.
Rose Evans asks a question for you both. Which of your own books is your favorite and why?
It's the favorite child question.
I mean, I don't really like any of them. I wouldn't say that about my children, but no, I don't know. I guess I like to think I've kind of got better as a writer as I've continued writing, and therefore I guess I think my most recent one is my best one. But in a way, I'm quite attached to my third novel, The Clockwork Girl, because I wrote that. That was a very hard novel to write. I wrote it out of contract after I'd been turned down by my previous publisher, and it was a real slog to write it. And but I really had to sort of overcome some issues to do it. So I'm kind of fond of that one because I did it and it was a success. So I'm kind of fond of that one in a way.
Yeah,
I suppose.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the one I'm writing at the moment is going to be good, but so I think, the first one's got a special place in my heart because it was the first one and it unlocked everything that followed. Whereas The Darker Sin was just written through 2020 lockdowns, and it was just torture from end to end.
Yeah,
all the writers, every who wrote a lockdown book. I think if I had just been like, oh, I'm on furlough, I'll write a book. Won't that be lovely? But of course, if you've got homeschooling to do, or you've got a job you still have to do, and you're trying to do it during lockdown where you're stressed to the eyeballs. So a lot of people, the Darker Sin's got better reviews than City of Vengeance. But for me, all I can think about is how stressed I was writing that book. Yeah. So it's tainted by the circumstances of the writing.
I know what you mean. And I think actually you're right. Actually, that's maybe why I don't feel as fond of the House of Whispers as I should do, because again, that was written largely in lockdown. Well, I was supposed to be homeschooling, so
there we go.
Dark days.
Yeah, well, but I'm very fond of Ritual of Fire just because it's the closest I'm probably going to get to like an action movie Aldo book, because it's the scope is big and the special effects budget would be enormous if they did it with the endless fire. So yes,
love it. Two more questions. One for me, and then there's one more in the chat from Frank. I'm curious, guy. I had this conversation earlier today with a friend. We were discussing how the opening is sometimes the most difficult thing to nail with your book, and sometimes you just can't move on. You have a lot of stuff planned out, but you can't move on until you nail that opening. What's your process like with openings? Do you feel that way with them? Do they stop you from moving forward, or do you just say forget it and then come back to it at a later point?
Yeah, I mean, I always think that my opening, the original opening that I write, I know that is never going to be the opening of the book. Because with all of my books, whatever I've written in the beginning has ended up changing. It's happened with every single one of them. So I always think, don't spend too much time on this, because by the time you get to the end, it will be something else entirely. So I don't labor too much until I get to the end of the first draft. And then I will, try work on polishing. Because obviously, especially with now, and people will get a sample on their Kindle or whatever, you need to make sure that those first few pages are really hooking them in, or as good as they can be. And certainly because it's historical fiction, you want to be really immersing them in that era. So at the end, once I've done the first draft, then I'll focus on it. But I try not to let myself get stuck on the opening when I'm doing the first draft.
Yeah.
Whereas I absolutely obsess about the first sentence.
Yep.
It's because the first sentence of City of Vengeance was like, oh, that's it, and it can be the last sentence as well, and then the whole thing's a giant circle, and I'm like, yay! And so it was one of the things that unlocked the writing of the book for me. And in book 2, I just go, it's 80 pages before we get to a corpse. You can't do this. So I went back and rewrote the beginning and had a flash forward effectively to try and indicate, and there's a corpse, by the way. So then people would stick around until we finally got to the body.
Yes,
I've
just changed my legal thriller so that the first scene now has someone nearly dying, because otherwise they're not going to find the book. Unfortunately, if it says crime on the tin, you have to have crime in it fairly early on.
It's true.
Yeah, absolutely. So now I've become obsessed with opening sentences and trying to always make the opening sentence also be the last sentence. And I couldn't do it for 2. I did do it with 3 for Ritual of Fire, the first and last sentences, and have very different meanings when you get them at either end of the book. But it's not going to happen with 4, and I've learned to try and relax.
Well, then it's like an every other book thing then. So 1 has
possibly.
It, 2 doesn't, 3 has it.
Don't say that. I've got to write a book 5 at some point.
Well, there you go. Then that's the trick. You got to do it. You got to stick to that pattern.
It's going to be like I've got a friend of mine, Nell Patterson, and she says she's like reverse. She's like Star Trek films. She always prefers even numbered books.
But I mean, I'm not going to get into a Star Trek chat, but they're all good. I think they're all good. The original films are all good in some way. Even 5 has some interesting bits in it. But Star Trek.
Okay, don't come out the rabbit hole now, Luke.
Yeah, I know. We got to wrap this up. So we'll save that for another conversation. But so two more quick comments in the questions in the chat. Frank asks, have you accidentally repeated scenes or moments from your previous work?
Not knowingly, but who knows? Someone who's read all my books can tell me. I have realized that in the novel I'm writing at the moment, the relationship between the father and son is too similar to the one in my first novel. I've realized I'm repeating that relationship. But I don't, to my knowledge, I've never repeated. But it's interesting how lots of writers do that. I mean, I tend to go on a binge of a certain author, and you will notice when you're doing that there will be recurrent phrases and maybe occasionally relationships and scenarios that do recur. I mean, it's not surprising, is it?
Yeah. I think if you read enough of a writer, you feel like, oh, I've seen your tricks now. Here we go. Yes. Oh, here it is. It's time for this one. Oh dear. I mean, to try and avoid repeating myself, I deliberately, each book in the Aldo series is a different subgenre. So the first one's conspiracy thriller, the second one's locked room, the third one is vendetta, the fourth one is serial killer, and if I get to write 5, it'll be espionage thriller. So
nice. Oh, cool. Nice, very nice. Someone in the chat says hi there. For some MZM Creations says hi there. So hello, how are you? Thanks for listening. In the last question, we actually sort of touched on this, but this is from David Bending. Asks, what's your take on the idea of having sensitivity readers? We covered that earlier. I don't know if we need to go over that again, but the general consensus was, I think you mentioned, Anna, that Ollie Munson said it's
authenticity readers,
authenticity readers, which was a better way of phrasing it, and that they can be helpful because they help you pick up on things that you might not be aware of. So they are useful. And I do think there's a lot of it's unfortunate because there's a lot of negativity around the word sensitivity. I think that had that word not been used and had it been authenticity from the beginning, I think the discourse around this whole aspect would probably not have been as heated.
But also, it's also worth saying about sensitivity readers that although I definitely think they're useful, having had 2 different views from 2 different people, they can be conflicting.
Yes.
So, do definitely have a sensitivity reader, but I also think if you can get views from your friends, and obviously use your own judgment.
Yeah, definitely.
Work out whether what you're being told is right.
Yeah.
You can't just accept the word of one person, I would say.
Yeah. I wholeheartedly agree with that. Okay, cool. I guess we'll wrap up here. This was a lot of fun. David and Anna, thanks for hanging out with me tonight, chatting about historical fiction, how you dive in and how you write your books and things. Is there anything you'd like to advertise at the moment? I will say there are links in the description, so anyone listening can go and click on those and find your books and buy your books. But do you want to tell people where they can find you? Advertise anything that you're working on at the moment?
Okay, well, I'm at David Bishop on Twitter. I've been on Twitter for so long, I have my own name. Otherwise I'm at Cesare Aldo pretty much everywhere else, Instagram and Oh God, Lemonade. I've just joined. I seem to be on every. I've got 1,000
What
different
that
social
is?
media
What is that?
platforms.
I don't know either.
Basically, it's like Instagram meets Pinterest. It's a lot of pictures of people in clothes, from what I can tell, which I guess is better than the alternative.
Amazing.
Just be porn.
I'm advertising my cat. This is Sydney.
Oh,
He's my writing assistant. To be honest, he's pretty useless as a writing assistant.
oh.
Yeah, I'm all over social media as well. Do come and follow me. I'm Anna_Maz, MAZZ on Twitter, and I'm Anna Mazzola writer on Instagram and Facebook. I'm not on anything else yet because I already waste too much time. I've been told I have to be on TikTok, but I feel like I'm just too old and I'll just embarrass myself.
TikTok is useless. I know people tell authors to go on it, but it's useless. It's mainly girls dancing around doing yoga. I don't need to see it. It's fine.
But BookTok is massive. BookTok. My agent was telling me that basically the top 10 is now made up of TikTok books.
Oh, I don't believe
maybe
it.
I noticed that Frank has suggested that Sydney should be a guest on your show, but maybe he should also have his own TikTok account. Maybe that's where the future of
yes.
And he says Luke had the best TikTok.
No, I didn't. What was the best one? I tried it and it was useless. The whole thing. Oh my gosh, it was just. Here's the thing. Here's the problem with TikTok, and then we'll go. Is you have to spend so much time brainstorming what your video is going to be, what the creative thing, what the comedy angle is, that it's like that's just useful time you could have been writing your book. So why am I spending an hour trying to produce some lip syncing bullshit when I could be writing my book? That's my take. I'm just like, it's a waste of time. I don't think writers should be wasting their time with it. That's my hot take for the day.
Okay, I'm glad you said that because I can't quite face it, but I also do think I need a young person to advertise my books on TikTok. I'm waiting till my kids are a bit too young, but
right.
My 12-year-old, I'm giving him a bit of time. He's currently got a YouTube channel which is about geography, but I'm giving him a bit longer, and then I reckon it's time for him to do my TikTok.
Yes.
Yeah, I think start monetizing those children. Yeah.
Exactly. There you go. That's why we have kids, right?
Absolutely. But Luke, thank you so much for having us. It's been lovely chatting to you both. And thank you to everyone listening and for your lovely questions.
Yes, thank you very much.
No problem. All right, we will see you guys next week. Oh, I just saw Frank's comment. I made Baby Yoda videos. I had a baby. Yeah, they were funny, but no one liked them, so it's all fine. Anyway, this was a lot of fun. We will see you guys at a later point. I hope we can have you back on again, David. I know this is your second time on the show, so hopefully, Anna, we can have you back on at some point in the future as well.
Yeah, I'd love to. Sydney will be more of a feature in the next one, and maybe Amber Snake will also make an appearance. Who knows? There we go.
Yeah, everyone, I will be back next week with another crime themed night. We're talking Sherlock Holmes on TV and film with a couple of Sherlock Holmes experts. That should be fun. So I'll see everyone next week. Until then, adios.
Bye, everyone.